Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Free Lunch. We are very excited to have you listen to our weekly conversations on the economic themes that really affect our lives. Joined with me today again, as always, is Kim Karaoke, Engagement Director at Busara. Kim, how have you been?
I've been very well, Ken. Thank you for teeing us off. And it's exciting. It's another week where we get to talk to people and to reflect on the things that are happening in our economic lives that affect our budgets, that affect our livelihoods. So, great to be connected again and looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. I think it's been very exciting week for me. I mean, obviously, last week was budget day, which is almost like the mecca for all economists.
Right.
And some interesting conversations were really coming out in terms of where are we in terms of the Big Four agenda? Is the COVID situation going to derail the Big Four agenda? And there's been particular discussion on issues of affordable housing and where are we with that? And I just got this morning, I was in a discussion on the same topic, and it's been coming up quite a lot. And I just wanted to get your initial thoughts on that pillar of the Big Four agenda. What are your thoughts on it?
No, I love the fact that you've anchored on the Big Four agenda. I think it was very ambitious when the president initially announced it about 3 years ago or thereabouts. And I've been an avid follower of trying to see how does this actualize in the lives of ordinary Kenyans. And, in relation to this past week and the issue about the affordable housing, I was super motivated and excited about the fact that it seems like the private sector is warming to really putting their money where their mouth is. So this past week, we had a few big banks in Kenya, I believe number one, number three, number one, number two, number three, and some other smaller institutions as well, come behind and put aside a total of about $3.35 billion towards supporting an affordable housing program. So really excited that the Big Four agenda and affordable housing being central to all of that is finally beginning to pick up.
Excellent. When I think about the Big Four agenda, I think one challenge that has been there in the past, even before COVID, there had been some feeling that there was some lethargy around it.
Yeah.
And for me, I've always thought of the Big Four in terms of two perspectives.
Yeah.
There is option A, where the government really comes and does everything, which is a very expensive venture because each of these pillars requires billions of dollars to be able to achieve. And at a situation when our public debt is quite high and COVID now has come with us, I find it, even financing it becomes a big challenge. But then when I thought about option two, where it's really the government creating an enabling environment and being able to pull in other players, it could be the counties, it could be the private sector, it could be NGOs. I find that to be sort of like a more plausible approach, especially from a financing perspective. Do you get that sense, or did you have a different view?
No, I totally get that sense, and I couldn't agree with you more. I sort of see the idea of a Big Four agenda of, it's kind of like setting your New Year's resolution, right? But like setting your New Year's resolutions for the next 5 years. And so you never really know how things will work out. You never really know if development partners or the rest of government or the nation will come behind you and rally alongside you to get this done. So I can understand how in the early days, it just felt more or less like a pipe dream, like this are like my Big Four wishes. But then, it's great that, if I think what's really powerful behaviorally is the idea to signal. So if you tell people like, hey, I want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, that already draws a line in the sand. And then it's easy, not always 100% conversion, but at least it's easier to then have conversations. And once people know what you're about, development partners, funders, bilaterals, begin to understand, okay, and the private sector as well, begin to understand, okay, this is what, the priorities are. And, this is how we should add value, or this is how we can add value in those lines. And it reminds me almost of the Millennium Development Goals or the Standard Development Goals, like the moment you have something written down, there's something about that action. You overcome the inertia of thought to actually start creating some action. And then, it's easier for people to come alongside you and say, okay, this is a heavy fight that you have to fight. Let's come alongside you. Let's be the wind beneath your wings. Let's be the air behind your sails, and let's help you push.
Oh, that's powerful. I think you've introduced the signaling effect, which is a key pillar of behavioral economics, and it's quite profound. I mean, even the scriptures say, as a man thinketh, and I think you're right. There's something powerful about committing to something, and it moves you away from changing goalposts, which sometimes is sort of like a challenge for many administrations. And just thinking about it, obviously home ownership is such a big conversation. I mean, to purchase a home is the largest, is sort of like almost the biggest expenditure for most people. And when people talk about affordable housing, one of the definitions of affordable, one of the key questions has been, what is the definition of affordable housing? And this morning in my earlier webinar on that, somebody, I believe it was from Housing Finance, finally gave a definition, and they said, anytime you spend less than 30% of your income on housing, then that can be considered to be affordable housing. And for me, it was quite nice that finally somebody, there's some nice round numbers people are putting out there. Do you agree with that definition?
To be honest, I really struggle as well with this idea of affordable, because I wonder if it's also, and again, so going back to behavioral economics, like, yes, love the idea that it's signaling that, this is what it is. It's probably anchoring people to expect certain things as well. But I don't like the fact that it may not necessarily have a strong association with quality. So some of the things we like to do in the business is is an implicit association test. So if you put different things side by side, what do people tend to associate? So if you, especially when it comes to Kenyan housing or large infrastructure projects, for some reason, in my mind, when someone says affordable, I don't necessarily think high quality.
Because pricing signals quality, right?
Exactly. And the fact that it was already positioned for low income, I just sort of feel like, yes, the 30% is helpful. So I was trying to do some quick math. If you're earning $1,000, then what 30% of that is, what is that? I guess my math today is pretty wonky. $300. Yeah. So it's nice to have a figure around it, but I wish it was affordable, high quality housing program, right? Because especially in this market where people are so value conscious, when you say something's affordable, it might not necessarily translate to value for money. Yeah, there's a school of thought that folks will think, that's just going to be cheap. And sadly, there's been some experience with not necessarily the low income housing projects, but medium to high, where quality has been an issue. So even when it's high or super expensive housing program, quality has been an issue. So it raises concerns for me slightly on whether, if already your margins are quite constrained because you're trying to make the housing scheme affordable, will you deliver to the best quality? Is there room for maintenance costs and maintenance support to be provided either by the constructor or even the person purchasing the home, the new homeowner?
Very, very powerful. Well, let's really unpack what affordable housing is. And when I think about it, the three big costs that come to mind is always the cost of land, the cost of financing, and obviously the cost of building material. Which of these three do you want to start with?
Very good point. I think let's talk with the material, because technically, yes. I mean, I agree with you. The land is a big issue, and land prices have been appreciating over and over. There have been concerns and questions whether there's a housing bubble that's about to burst. But certainly within the context of this affordable housing program, I would like to think, if everything I saw was fairly accurate, that the government was trying to prioritize public land that had already been set aside for construction. So ordinarily, yes, I would immediately anchor on the land issue. But within this affordable housing framework, I certainly see, if the government is trying to use some of its public land to resettle people, I imagine the government is going to absorb some of the land costs. Right. But the bigger challenge then becomes, cost of construction. And I think ultimately that's also a side that we don't speak about much, but has significant influence on the duration that it takes to complete the house, how many houses can be constructed within a finite span of time just because of the complexity and the curing process, and then ultimately what you're talking about, which is the cost.
And indeed, in fact, one of the key issues that always comes to my mind, especially when I'm discussing this particular topic, is obviously you have lived in the United States and you remember how houses there were mostly built from timber.
Yeah.
And for the life of me, I've always wondered, and it's been very popular in the US for years, centuries.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered why that tradition has never developed here, because in my mind, people tend to say they are more aesthetically beautiful,
right,
and they cost less. But why do you think that has never? Obviously, access to quality wood is something that can be a barrier, because the US has huge amounts of forests and everything.
Yeah.
But that particular point, what has been your view when you compare the US and Kenya in terms of that particular building material of wood?
No, it's such a good one. And I think maybe I would even take it back into our history a little bit and wonder whether there's a bit of a status quo bias that has settled. Because when you think indigenously how Africans were constructing houses, that sucker could be up in a day or half a day, right? Between you putting, a few sticks for the frame, of course, digging it out, leveling the ground, putting a few sticks for the frame, tying up those sticks with some reeds, thatching it, thatching the roof. And if you're listening to this, I'm sure you can figure out I'm not a construction person. So likely this is not the way you should build a house. So please don't listen to this to get building advice from me. But yes, putting mud around the walls of the structure to create a house, that wouldn't take a very long span of time. But then, of course, when the settlers came in, we, I think, imitated a way of constructing houses, which one could argue was a little bit more permanent. In a sense, there's less likelihood that, a cow that just ended up, found itself in the wrong place would accidentally come and knock your wall and cave in your whole house. If you have something made of brick, it's a little more robust. But certainly, that takes longer to construct. And so what I think we did is coming into independence and, in the early years, whereas, there was now a dire need to start rethinking about getting people settled, thinking about giving people quality housing, we never really began to think, okay, there was a way we used to do things and in the past, and that seems to have been overshadowed by everything we know now. But is that really fit for purpose, given that we have to address housing inequalities? So you had people, and to be honest, like, there are other ways of building houses, and in the early days, you definitely see people building houses with corrugated iron sheets. So you still have your same wooden substructure and then a metallic frame around. But then also, behaviorally, let's think about the fact that, what's aspirational. So if you thought, or growing up, that the most aspirational thing you could do was to build a stone house, then everything else around that is subpar. It's not meeting your expectation, maybe meeting your need, but not your highest level of expectation. And so anytime income would increase or anytime you'd have an opportunity, you would quickly look to upsell or upgrade your structure. So I think over time, there were definitely interim compromise solutions that for those that could upgrade, definitely upgraded. For those that couldn't upgrade, still remained with the mabati or a corrugated iron sheet house. or your traditional house. But I think the challenge has always been, aspiration has been, I want a stone house with a red brick roof. Similarly to how in the US, you have a white house with a picket fence and a bit of a yard, right? So aspiration is also driving much of this. And so that also sort of seeps into building regulations, etc.
Oh, wow, that's very fascinating, that aspirational part, which indeed plays a big part in our decision making. And obviously, when you talk about material, there's a physical material, but there's also the labor. Yeah. And the idea that somebody tried to suggest it earlier this morning is a possible stimulus measure into the economy is if the government can put up a huge number of these affordable housing homes and have local labor be able to participate in the construction of these things. And then there's always the issue of, do we have the right skills? Obviously that part of the vocational labor, which always seems to be something that has been recently addressed through TVET. Right. But our labor force is, are we there yet in terms of being able to fully domesticate the building of affordable homes?
I think we're certainly on the right path. The sense I have is, we've definitely been fortunate to accept a number of interesting technologies from everywhere. So in the early 2000s, we started seeing a lot of houses that are being built through prefabricated materials, or, you could create a brick out of mud that's been mixed with either cow dung or something else, and you get a brick building machine and compress that and make it firm enough to actually create a really beautiful house. So I think the technology is certainly there. People have been trained. It's been mainly private sector led. Mm-hmm. But I think until we get to a place, certainly and this is where now quality starts coming in, because there's an issue. So if you talk to building constructors, folks are generally okay with alternative approaches to building. But when it comes to being able to put your signature and affirm that this building is structurally sound, when you have to put your neck out on the line with an untested technology, then you have a bit of hesitation. And certainly some of these technologies I don't think are yet to the point where you can have a multi-storied house. It'll probably just be one level, which is fine, again, at the end of the day, if you're talking about a low-income household. But the other piece of this that also has been difficult to come to bear in mind is even that has a cost. So even the brick house that could be fairly simple and quick to erect has a cost that it's unclear who's going to shoulder. And that's where I think then we start missing it a bit, right? Because if you ask a financier, would I rather finance, and Ken, you've been a banker, you probably know this better than us, do I finance a small loan versus a bigger loan for a short span of time versus a longer span of time? I think depending on who you ask, whether you're talking to a microfinance person or a person with a microfinance background or like a retail banker, the answer could be very different. And so it might be more efficient to finance, let's say, a housing development that's built on brick, that's 40, 50 million to construct. That's one loan. We are done. I've hit my targets. The branch is happy. My manager is happy, especially from a retail perspective. Then to finance small loans of, say, $1,000, $2,000 a piece to try and get my way up to, a $40,000 target. Like just the cost, the sheer administrative cost and the burden is very different, especially because each of those small loan applications, you still have to do KYC and due diligence. So then you find as well the finances and the market itself tends to correct towards certain types of solutions.
Mm-hmm. And I love how you've introduced the finance part, which is an important part. But even before we move to that finance part, maybe lastly on the materials part, and I know you live close to Bomas of Kenya, and you go there and you really look at the anthropology of Kenyan homes. Obviously, Bomas means the houses of Kenyans from a pre-colonial setup. And one of the themes that you and I are very passionate about is the issue of resilience and in these areas. Do you feel, as we think about affordable housing, do you feel we are utilizing all the anthropological knowledge of our historical communities?
It's a very good question. And I think it goes back to, again, aspiration and sort of what we perceive to be of value. So one of the things that I love every time I travel, and whenever I go to Rwanda, I particularly am amazed by their infrastructure. Because they will build something, and not necessarily or even low cost, but they will build a structure that is modern and contemporary, but has a very strong feel and theme of the local anthropology. So they'll build a structure that's dome-shaped, or you walk into an office that's your normal high-rise office and still has a little bit of the traditional flair and feel to it. So it might be a scenario where we are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'll be the first to admit, like a Mabati house or a house with an iron sheet roof can be particularly noisy, especially when it rains. And, if someone kicks it just right, they can cut through your wall. So, there are definitely some challenges, and certainly a mud structure or something more ethnic could also have the similar challenges. But it's interesting how in the big cities we sort of moved away, especially in Nairobi, we've moved away from maintaining some of that cultural identity. And it's sad, it's only when you visit some of our tourist resorts or other places where you still see a bit of the indigenous mixed in with the modern and contemporary. So I wouldn't be opposed, for example, to have a concrete superstructure and substructure for integrity, but then have a roof that's a mix of thatch versus something else that's maybe a bit more organic, easier for us to incorporate the local talent that you're talking about. And then also that perhaps turns the cost of the construction, reduces the cost and increases the time to completion. Because the roof by itself can also be fairly complicated to do and also is fairly expensive. So if there are ways to get around, designing those solutions quickly, more affordably, and of high quality, I'm very much for that.
I completely agree with you. I think that fusion between the form, function, and aesthetics, I think are very interesting. And it's something, I guess, even in our curricula, having architects who also taking classes in anthropology and fusing these things. And just reminds me of a movie I was watching last Sunday. It's called The Journey, really talking about the Northern Ireland peace process. And you could see the places where the peace meetings were being held were these ancient Scottish castles, but on the inside they were extremely modern.
Right.
And I was like, wow, what a beautiful sort of blend of the Celtic past and a very progressive future. But I think moving on to finance, I think just to back to what we were discussing, obviously here for Kenya, the big topic has been around the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Company, which has been sort of going to be sort of like anchoring sort of long-term, low-cost financing to this. And I think you talked about really the place of finance when you really think about this. And even early in our discussions, I remember one of the people was saying, if somebody can be able to pay 25,000 shillings for the next 20 years or $250 for the next 20 years and own a place, how amazing it is. But just going back to the part of aspirations, which you really raised up earlier, do you find that drive to affordable housing sort of killing the aspirations of people? Because a lot of people who are living in these low income setups, for them, this is a solution for the here and now.
Yeah.
They really want to get some big break
Yeah.
and be able to design something great. A lot of people, the reason they go into business or the reason they really invest in enterprise is they want to have really, as you say, aspirational homes.
Yeah.
Do you find this idea of locking people into long-term of these homes kind of kills sort of like a part of their soul?
I know what you mean. And, just when you're talking about something about Europe, it actually reminded me, and I want to correct myself. It just made me flash back that even in Kenya's history, we did have a time where wood was being used for construction and even for construction of homes. And when you were talking about that, I quickly flashed back to even in my rural setup, we have a superstructure there that is now a granary. But initially it was a house made of wood. So it was completely wood, roof top to bottom, and then it was raised off the ground. But of course, as incomes increased, then people went to brick. And so it sort of speaks to this idea of aspiration. And on the segment, I think my word of the day for today truly is segmentation. So you're right. There's different sorts of people, and they found themselves in, shall I say, less than ideal housing for different reasons. So you have, some civil servants who are working in Nairobi, and these may be policemen, these may be other members of the armed and disciplined forces, who are living in less than ideal structures. And so for them, yes, ultimately, I think it's fair to say that aspiration will be for them to get the best out there. And so they may be prime candidates for the affordable housing program. And there's a sense to which it's important to give them at least something to start, something that's better than super low quality that quite frankly some of them have been exposed to. But then as well, there are people for whom they just want something that looks nice. So you rightly alluded to at the beginning of this conversation that I had a chance to live overseas, and to be honest, like I've always had a high aspiration to a multi-storied house. And maybe that's because of our education system, etc. Or maybe just because it communicated a certain level of wealth and class. But then when I thought of the average middle class in the US, most of them are in single-storied buildings. And then towards the end of my tenure in the US and preparing to come back, I spent some time in a non-flat. So for the most of the time I was staying in a flat, and then actually spent time in a house. And realize that a single story home has a lot of appeal. I like the fact that I can sit on one end of the house and see a proper 360. I can see my garden, I can see the other side of the house, I can walk to my bedroom. I actually love the open space that it created, but that's coming into the form factor issue. So I think there are ways in which we can create enough in the system, in the pipeline, for each person to be able to self-select and say, I want a multi-story home, and I want to leverage my single-story home that I purchased through this affordable housing program. And you rightly mentioned some figures. If I can make that minimum deposit over time, I can then own this home and perhaps upgrade later. My concern, to be honest, is that if we don't address quality, what will likely happen is that you will have an influx and oversupply, an influx of providers and an oversupply and potential explosion of low-cost housing units that then ultimately may push down costs. And because these mortgages are fixed, you may find people unable to pay, walkouts could easily result, and ultimately then the need that you had to serve people goes unmet.
Wow, that's a very powerful part, especially that part on the walkouts, especially knowing how volatile people's incomes are. The bottom end of the pyramid, expecting people to be able to make monthly payments.
Yes.
When things are very touch and go in most of these sectors. I think it's a powerful point that we need to reflect on. But I think maybe one last point I'd like to pick your mind would be what happened in Nairobi in the 1980s, in the 1970s and 80s, when the issue of council houses came up.
Yeah.
So you had areas such as Buruburu, which I was born in, and places like the South Bs, South Seas, and they were really represented the middle class. People who had come, our parents who had come from up country, they had this, now you're part of the city, you're part of the urban bourgeoisie. And it was quite interesting. But when I think about the deterioration of these suburbs over the last 30 years, it's been quite profound. And we talk about affordable housing, and I ask myself, wasn't that affordable housing 1.0? And did we just not maintain these things very well? Because when I went my first time in London, when I saw the council estates, I was like, what Nairobi was meant to be.
Exactly.
Very, very similar. You go through the council estate in London, and you're like, wow, this is what the vision was. But I guess when people started buying this property privately, and sort of like that social contract started ripping apart, and grabbing came up. So when I go to these areas today, I mean, if I go to the place I grew up, it doesn't sort of invoke the strong emotions I had when I was growing up. So are we not learning from the past? Are we trying to sort of, as we move into these things, are we not really trying to learn from the past?
I hope we would be. And I think one thing you sort of rightly stated is we might need to make a distinction between affordable housing and poor people housing. Because I think part of the thing that has happened is that you're absolutely right. Like, we destroyed the appeal and the allure of the council houses, and we let those sort of fall by the wayside and get degraded. And there's some effort now, especially around Lavington. You'll see some of these council houses being re-upgraded, and many of them are being converted into office spaces. But by and large, like the areas you talked about in Buruburu, Isili, South C, South B, most of those have just been, derelict and just in a poor state of affairs, and even the environment around it. So the sanitation has also broken down, lack of water, lack of amenities like garbage collection, like all of that has just buckled under the pressure of neglect. But also the other thing that has happened is, because of poor planning, the influx of people who came into the cities to look for work or to support the work that's ongoing, not everyone landed into those council homes. Folks had to find other ways to survive, and so ended up finding themselves in some of the big slums. And this is my thing as well. Like, I worry as well, with all this effort for low cost housing, is it really addressing everyone, or is it just making it more affordable, but the folks who really do need the intervention, people who are living in slums, people who are living in informal settlements, who, by the way, keep getting kicked out every other day by the government, because the government's trying to find space for some of these projects, or even for water towers, etc. Are we creating something for them? One of the things, I recently traveled to Cape Town, and it feels like a while back now because of COVID. But I love seeing how the townships, they've had an upgrading of townships. And so you look at the townships and they actually look amazing. Like, every little house, and maybe it's just because it's South Africa, every little house has a dish. So you'll see DSTV, 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 DSTV everywhere. So you definitely don't have to ask a question of who's the market leader when it comes to premium and paid for TV. Like, that's just answered right away. But like, every little house it looks amazing. Like, yes, it is a relatively small home, but it's been painted. It's the community is vibrant. There's a little compound and a garden. And I worry that our quest for affordable housing is actually not going to reach the people who need it the most. It'll touch a few, but for those who are living in informal settlements and slums, they may just be left peering in and seeing what could be, and wondering when it's their turn.
Wow, I completely agree with you, and that's a very profound point. In fact, when you even talk about the slums, and why is it Kenya has more slums than maybe our East African counterparts? And we have to think about the economic issues, how in Nairobi it only seems like cash is around Nairobi and work is around Nairobi, so everybody has to come to Nairobi. So imagine things like devolution, which are meant to sort of decentralize the economy, would have assisted. But I would love to do a research on whether that has really happened. Well, do you have any final final words on this topic? This is something we can have 5 episodes on. It's a
I think so. It's very loaded. Yeah, very loaded.
Maybe you can close us off.
No, happy to. I think maybe final thoughts is this is certainly a complex issue. I think it's great to see good government initiatives kicking off. I think I'm just curious and would love to see some thought put around quality, so that the past experiences where people have moved into these quote unquote affordable homes and then things are collapsing within the first 6 months and people don't even have money to repair them. And then it's humongous structural defects like sinking foundations or water leakages from poor plumbing. Hopefully those get addressed. Would also love to see some effort and investment in upgrading the slums and creating scenarios and options that are credible and open. And maybe just anecdotally as we pen off, I also remember a scenario where the government tried to, at least in Kenya, to move people out of the slums. And what happened in that case was people actually received the homes, didn't attempt to move, but actually ended up renting out those homes. So the idea was noble. Let's get people out of the slum and let's put them into these affordable cost houses. They actually ended up just renting out the quote unquote low income homes, or these poor people homes to low income individuals, and they remained in their existing solution. So I think it goes to show that we might be thinking we're optimizing to solve one problem, but then at the heart of the matter, there are bigger issues to be addressed. So in fact, in that scenario, I completely saluted the folks who stayed back into the homes that they could actually afford to manage, because the big issue was we can't afford to maintain these low-cost homes that we've been given. But yeah, no, very interesting topic, and I think I agree with you. We could talk about this for on and on. And thank you all for our listeners for being attentive, and really curious to hear what people's thoughts are, and if folks would want to learn more, to hear more, and we can definitely talk about different aspects, look at different markets, different contexts, and really peel apart this onion. Ken, what do you think?
Absolutely, very well said. To all our listeners, if you have any comments, feel free to post your comments on our social media pages. We'd love to hear whether you agree or disagree. What are the topics you'd like us to explore? And really, it's just about building community and encouraging open dialogue about the economic themes that affect our lives. Have a great weekend, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Cheers. Have a good one, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.